Wednesday, June 17th, 2015, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are two of my colleagues, Mike McKean and Jamie Gray. On our program this week, an Arkansas judge finds a TV reporter in contempt for live tweeting from his courtroom. No, there were no fines issued or jail time set, but there was a sentence. We're going to talk about whether or not whether or not the panelists think he should comply. The Sunday Times, one of Rupert Murdoch's newspapers, ran a story that claims the Russians and Chinese cracked the files at Edward Snowden leak 2 years ago, but the story relies heavily on anonymous sources. There's not a whole lot of evidence there, and there's also an accurate passage that was removed. We're also going to talk about Rupert Murdoch himself and the announcement he's stepping down as the head of 20th Century Fox. There's hopefully a whole lot more that we'll get to as well, but we're going to start with that Media Circus that's descended on Spokane, Washington this week. By now, you've seen, heard, and watched the now former NAACP leader Rachel Dolezal talk about her racial identity. She appeared in a series of interviews on the NBC network, starting with Matt Lauer on the Today Show and ending with Melissa Harris Perry over on MSNBC. But it really all started with one pointed question asked by KXLY-TV's Jeff Humphrey.
Is that your dad?
Yeah, that's my dad.
This man right here is your father? Right there?
You have a question about that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I was wondering if your dad really is an African-American man.
That's a very, I don't know what you're implying.
Are you African-American?
I don't understand the question of, I did tell you that, yes, that's my dad. And he was unable to come in January.
Are your parents, are they white?
So that was the moment right there, the one that broke this whole story wide open when the reporter asks that gotcha question. Jamie, talk to us for a second about what that's like, to be that person holding the microphone in a moment like that.
Well, it's a tricky one, and this is a question I posed to my students actually this week, is you have to go back to story zero, if you will, on this. Somebody had to go ask the question to begin with, are you African American, are you black? And how uncomfortable that must have been to get that assignment. And in my class, we talked about, is that an appropriate question to ask someone? And the conclusion we came to in this case, of course, is that she had used her race to talk about her life experiences. She is a public figure. She is a person who has come out with statements about her race in the public. And so, yes, it is a question that I think is fair to ask, but then we all saw what unraveled after that. So it's easy to say, of course it's a story now, but that story zero was probably a tough call for that first newsroom to make.
And I think it was legitimate, too, because if you know the context of the story locally, as you were saying, I mean, she not only was using her racial identity for her public persona in her job, but she also made several allegations, ones that there was very little evidence for, that she had personally been the victim of hate crimes. And it's pretty safe to say that both this television station and the newspaper in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, that also was breaking it at about the same time, was going on leaks from law enforcement and other people who'd been investigating these sort of thinly sourced hate crimes that she was alleging.
And even, I believe it was also KXLY, who went back again after this whole story had broken, went and sat down with her. It looked like it must have been in her office, and again asked that question, are you African American? And she, again, wouldn't really answer it, instead saying that she didn't like the term African American, that she preferred the term black, but again was really kind of skirting around it. It wasn't until more recently that we started to hear her talk about it more as an identity than a race that she was born with.
So this is kind of an interesting example. Jamie, you talked about story zero on the local level, where all news really is local, and that this has brought another dimension to the conversation about race in this country.
Well, and in fact, I mean, I think there are different motivations for why the local journalists were covering this story in the first place and what the national and international media did with it. I mean, there had been allegations, according to the news executives in that market for some time, that she was lying about her race, that she was making false claims about hate crimes. And it was not until they had enough evidence, reportedly, that they decided to ask this question. And then they went to her parents and asked her parents to document the claim, and that's when the story really broke free. And now the national and international media, I think, were probably their motivations for carrying the story were pretty simple. It was another example of the conversation about race. It was also fodder for the constant culture wars left and right. So it fit into kind of a more typical narrative for those media.
And maybe not even so typical. We had the culture war left and right. We also then found a connection made or not quite understood between Rachel Dolezal and Caitlyn Jenner, and the idea of identifying as transracial and a possible similarity with identifying as transgender.
I think those similarities that were drawn initially, though, were pretty quickly upended. Whether you believe that racial identity is something that exists or not, I think that pretty quickly the parallels between the two stories, it's pretty thin, just because in the way that these two individuals talked about themselves publicly, I think it's just so wildly different. You cannot draw those two things together.
Right. I mean, and there's a long, long history now that we go back about it with Jenner, and there's at least, a fair amount of scientific evidence that suggests that there is a biological or genetic, factor involved in being transgender. We didn't hear from Dolezal saying anything about being transracial until she had to come up with an excuse to cover for the falsehood she was telling.
And that's the difference, and especially how the coverage gets rolled out too, is the difference in how the individual person is representing themselves.
Okay, so let's talk about digital first newsrooms. Jamie, at KOMU, you expect reporters to be tweeting updates about their stories while they're out reporting. That's becoming the norm in most newsrooms these days. Well, there are some out there who aren't fans of the practice, like the City Council in Wilmar, Minnesota, where City Council members are considering a ban on cell phones in the council chambers to keep citizens and journalists alike from sending out dispatches from inside the meetings. And in Springdale, Arkansas, a judge found KFSM-TV's managing editor, Larry Henry, in contempt of court for tweeting the verdict in a murder trial. Here's where this one gets a little bit complicated. The judge ordered everyone's electronic devices, cameras, cell phones, recording devices, that they all be powered down before the trial started. And he said there was to be no text messaging or tweeting from the courtroom. Okay, that sounds fair enough. Not what we'd want, most likely, but fair enough. Okay, well, moments after the verdict was read, that TV reporter tweeted the verdict and was caught on courtroom security cameras doing it. But instead of fining him or having him spend a few days in jail for violating the order, the judge sentenced the journalist to produce a news story promoting awareness of child safety and gave him 30 days to air it. Are your heads spinning around this one as quickly as mine is?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's, first of all, if I were in the position of that reporter, I mean, yes, he did something that was strictly laid out as you cannot do this. And we know that they're in different courtrooms around the country on both ends of the spectrum. I've been in courtrooms where you can't even have a phone in the building, so then you have a fight for a payphone or a race to your car to get to your cell phone to try and call your newsroom and let them know what's going on, to being able to live tweet, if you will, a trial gavel to gavel. So there are those. Yes, he broke the rule that was laid out, but then this sentence, I'm shocked. I can't believe it. And if I were that journalist, I don't think that I would want to comply with it.
So go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I agree basically that I'd say, first of all, judges sometimes feel like they have a reason for doing this to protect the judicial process, to make sure there's no distractions in the courtroom. Journalists may not agree with all of those strictures, but at least there's a rationale for it. You mentioned a case, though, of city councils trying to say they're going to try to ban live. There is no rationale one can think of in a public forum with government doing business like that where you should block anyone from doing live tweeting.
Alternate sentencing. Okay, that's one thing. So he's a public figure. He works at a television station. You want to drive home the importance of child safety? Have him MC some event or something where he's out there and he's doing something that's providing community service in a way.
Yeah, you can't have judges dictating what stories are going to be covered or how they're going to be covered. On the other hand, I would have said if the judge had imposed a typical fine or even jail time for the reporter live tweeting, then the station would have come out and been angry about that too. So they, you can't have it both ways, but this alternative sentence just doesn't make any sense.
Well, it doesn't make sense. Does the punishment fit the crime, if you will? Why is that? I mean, that must be an issue that is close to the judge's heart, is all that I can figure. Why not say you need to do a report on the impacts of social media on court today or distractions in the courtroom? Do I think that that's an appropriate sentence either? No, I don't, because I don't think a judge should be telling any news organization what to cover. I mean, that is a fundamental right in this country, is the freedom of the press. And I just think it is such an overstep and a little bit strange.
I agree. The only thing I think that I would like to see, I'd like to see someone, including that television station, actually do a story that's available to the wider public about what happened in that courtroom. If you go online, at least, there is one story from a newspaper in Arkansas covering this. The television station, at least for searchable archives, there's nothing that they said about their own reporter violating the rules.
And I think that would be another thing, if the punishment were that there needs to be some type of apology made or an explanation given, I think that starts to get to a more appropriate type of punishment than dictating you must do a story on something totally unrelated to
the case was a murder case of a child.
Sure, but I think it's unrelated to the actual offense that the reporter
in the courtroom.
Yes, and I understand that, Ty, but I just don't think it quite fits in. And what's that story going to look like, and how do you lead into that? We were forced to bring you this story?
Pretty much.
Dear Judge, this is the court-ordered story on subject matter.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying to actually do that.
No.
Glenn Greenwald was among the first to point out problems with a different story that showed up in the Sunday Times of London this weekend, which quoted anonymous sources within 10 Downing Street who say the Chinese and Russians have cracked Snowden files, those files he reported on 2 years ago given to him by Edward Snowden, and that it poses a security threat. Greenwald called the Sunday Times' story, quote, the opposite of journalism, pointing to the reliance of anonymous sources, a lack of evidence, and some inaccuracies piecing together certain parts of the timeline. What we're left with, Greenwald and others have said, is a propaganda piece for the British government. Is it? See what you think after hearing CNN's George Howell ask the Sunday Times reporter about the breach.
You name unnamed sources. How do senior officials at number 10 Downing Street know that these files were breached?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, George. All we know is that this is effectively the official position of the British government. We picked up on it a while ago, and we've been working on it and trying to stand it up through multiple sources. And when we approached the British government late last week with our evidence, they confirmed effectively what you read today in the Sunday Times. So it's obviously allegations at the moment from our point of view, and it's really for the British government to defend it.
Well, I do have to ask, though, just in understanding the nature of what's in the files, how do they know what was in them if they were encrypted? Has the British government also gotten into these files?
Well, I mean, the files came from America and the UK, so they may already have known for some time what Snowden took. Again, that's not something that we're clear on, so we don't go into that level of detail in the story. We just publish what we believe to be the position of the British government at the moment.
Clip doesn't exactly give you a whole lot of confidence in the report in there, does it?
Well, I mean, that's the problem. I feel kind of sorry for the reporter being on the spot there, but truthfully, this was a thinly sourced story, and it was basically just giving someone within the Cameron government's point of view as to what was going on. They didn't provide any quotes from any named sources. They showed no evidence of any sort as to proof that the Chinese and Russians had access to this information. Nothing. And even though I think Glenn Greenwald is equally guilty many times, as he was in his response to name-calling and smearing just as much as the British government, he raised some pretty important points. I mean, first of all, no sources. That's pretty obvious. Number two, there was an actual factual mistake about Greenwald's partner having been to Russia and meeting with Snowden that the paper took out but didn't explain after they were called on it. And thirdly, you've got this whole notion that, well, Greenwald says at least, and the attorney for Snowden, that he never took any of this material with him to Moscow. He destroyed his copy and gave the other copies to the reporters. Now, that's also just an assertion. We have no proof of that. But I'd say that the evidence tends to stack up more on Greenwald's side this time, at least than what was presented by the reporters for the Sunday Times.
And I agree with that. It's the lack of sourcing, but I would also present, and maybe not in this particular case, but sometimes there are stories particularly of international significance, where we'll see other stories that are thinly sourced because of confidentiality. Someone could lose their job or worse in certain countries. And so this isn't the first time we've seen a thinly sourced story. In this case, though, I do think, at least with having Greenwald's perspective, and we do know some facts from that side, from if you want to call it Greenwald's side, that kind of lend itself to giving a little more context here. But there are plenty of international stories where you have to rely on what a reporter is telling you a confidential informant has told them.
I will have to say this, though. So the Sunday Times is owned by Murdoch. And that's why I would suspect that they're getting an awful lot of criticism when the BBC also reported this exact same thinly sourced story, and they're getting very little blowback from it compared at least to the Sunday Times.
So speaking of Murdoch, the Sunday Times is one of the many media properties that are in his portfolio. It's pretty vast, and based on reports that have been circulating in the last week, even as recently as yesterday, there's going to be a change at the top. 84-year-old Rupert Murdoch will hand over the reins to his son James on July 1st. He's going to be keeping the title of executive chairman. His other son, Lachlan, will assume the title of co-executive chairman. It's a publicly traded company, but it sure does seem like a family business when you look at it that way.
Got started that way, and it looks like it's going to stay that way for a while. And what's really interesting is how he brought the sons apparently back together, because basically Lachlan Murdoch had been sort of self-exiled to Australia because he didn't apparently run the company to Daddy's satisfaction. But James Murdoch was caught up in that whole problem with the phone hacking scandal in Great Britain, and yet here we are, what, a year or so later, and very quietly he's back up at the top of the company. So it says something about our short attention span on stories like that, or something that he can, so just walk right into the corporate suite without having to have any blowback from that scandal, which at the time we were all talking about and seemed very, very problematic.
Exactly.
Which almost felt like it could have been the end for it. Yeah.
Yeah. I just don't think that much will change going forward because of the scandal that you speak of, and kind of the top-down mentality of that news organization. He wasn't going to put someone in his place that was vastly different from himself. And so I anticipate that things will stay largely the same.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's one part of it that I think could change. Rupert Murdoch loved his newspapers. He started out with one newspaper in Australia and built this whole empire around it. Well, I don't think that James cares all that much for the newspapers. In fact, they split the newspaper and TV and entertainment businesses, and most of the money is being made by the TV networks, Fox News and others, and the entertainment business. So it could be that those newspapers might not survive Rupert Murdoch's leaving the company, if he really leaves it. I mean, before he leaves, the earth, because he may have his sons in place, but he may still be dictating some of the policy of the company.
Well, like perhaps seeing the newspaper spin off.
I mean, spin off to another owner, probably. Yeah.
So this is going to be the beginning of the end for Rupert Murdoch, the beginning of that exit. How do you think history is going to remember him and the impact he's had on the media industry up till now?
Boy, I think looking at 24-hour news cycles, looking at how media today, there are certain media outlets that may have a certain slant when you go into watching them. That was all born out of Rupert Murdoch and his organizations, and that's something that I think has just continued and maybe even widened a little bit more.
You know, with his political connections, he's been connected to people in power, both from the left and the right and in the center. So even though we think of him, Fox News Channel is synonymous with News Corp, it isn't exactly. But I will say it's also interesting to me that a lot of people speculate, including David Folkenflik, who's a media critic for NPR, that
who has written a book on the Murdochs.
And he says that James Murdoch isn't a big fan of Roger Ailes or the Fox News channel. So it could be interesting to see what happens there, because Ailes is getting older too. And, will the guy at the top still be as supportive of, the 800-pound gorilla that brings a heck of a lot of money to the company? I don't know.
Okay, well, Apple's WWDC conference makes headlines every year with word of updates to Apple operating systems, changes to development requirements, introducing new partnerships. Well, this year, journalists especially took note of the announcement of the new Apple News product. It's going to be a new app that will curate breaking news content to push it quickly to users. But we don't know exactly how it's going to work. We don't know which sources will rise to the top, and we aren't exactly sure how local news is going to factor into this. What we do know, though, is that earlier this week, Apple opened up and posted its first job posting for an Apple News editor. Based on that job description, which our listeners and viewers can find on our links blog if they want to read it themselves, what answers might we be able to glean from that?
I mean, I think that it will, in some ways, in the beginning, have to be dealt with and will look a little bit like how things are pushed out through any type of social media, because there are certain algorithms that exist in Facebook and Twitter that will drive certain content to the top. And so I think they're looking for someone that can take what's already out there and push it out in a different way and make it look different than what's already available.
I mean, basically, they're talking about it, at least for the time being, being a fancy aggregator like Flipboard or like Google Now. I mean, it's basically a way to take this content and present it in a format that digital audiences are interested in. Will it succeed? A lot of other people have tried the same thing and they have failed. But then Apple's got a, bazillion dollars behind it and a reputation behind it that might make it work. The things that interest me about this, though, Amy, are what they're offering publishers for the first time to try to entice them to play along with the new Apple News product. So first of all, they're giving them access to analytics that they have rarely, if ever, given people who have apps in their store. And publishers have been angry about that for a long time. They're giving them 100% of the ad revenue for any ads the publishers, sell themselves, which is different from the model for having apps in the App Store before. And they're also saying that they're going to give them tools to help them tie this into their content management systems, the way that stations and publishers get their content online to make it easier for them to make that transition. If all those things happen, I suspect a lot of publishers are going to sign on for it.
So is this going to almost become like the next generation? Maybe 10 years ago, we were really worried about search engine optimization. So if some of those CMS tools are incorporated, that maybe the same way you might be trying to game that search engine with maybe the right headline or the right keywords, maybe you're now trying to game Apple News. And
that's what I was really keying in on, especially as someone that works in a newsroom where we're constantly adapting to search engine optimization, to the latest Facebook algorithm. What words are we supposed to use in headlines, in Facebook postings? And so for me, it's going to be yet another consideration when we're writing, writing different headlines, writing content. And will this require even a larger digital staff? Because, as you say, with Apple being so high profile, I think this could have enough of an impact like Google. We all pay a lot of attention to Google SEO. Because of the Apple name and brand, I think it could become another huge player in newsrooms.
And what Apple has had out there for news consumers, the so-called news stand, which is a little bucket to put all your it's become a ghetto basically for news organizations, because your app is not sitting out there front and center on your home screen of your phone. You've got to dive down in at least one more layer to get to it, and publishers have hated that. So this is a much better option for them than what's been there so far.
Hated it from the beginning. Well, before we go today, here's one last one for you. Work at the New York Times. Go to the New York Times website to see what you're leading with or to check the archives. You're going to get a message telling you to pick up your mobile device and find what you're looking for on a phone or tablet. The idea behind this is to try and drive home the importance of mobile and build some reliance on those devices among editorial employees. I don't know, what do you think? Good idea, bad idea?
Do we really need more reliance on our cell phones? It's a miracle I can sit and tape this show and not be looking at my phone the entire time, so I think that's a little bit funny.
I mean, it is funny in a way, and it's a gimmick in a way. On the other hand, the New York Times, despite having some of the best mobile apps out there, lots of digital content, they're making more money from it than a lot of publishers. Their newsroom culture still hasn't caught up with, in some ways, the need to be mobile first or even digital first. There was a report that came out last year, an internal report that got leaked, which showed that, you know, there was still a lot of tension within the company. So here's a way of saying, since more than 50% of the New York Times' content reaches people via mobile devices, we're going to make you pay attention to mobile for a while by not accessing your content through your laptop.
And the idea of experience our content the way our readers experience the content.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting concept. And frankly, a good idea is to force your employees to be like your audience, because that will only make you better at serving that audience.
I mean, there was a similar kind of gimmick, I think it was a year or so ago, that USA Today did, where they made, I think it was Social Media Thursdays, or maybe it was Tuesdays, I don't remember the day, but every employee in the newsroom had to not only observe social media, but add something to the social media accounts of USA Today. Sure, it's a gimmick, but it says, pay attention to social media. This is where people are being directed to our content. You've got to know what they're saying and how it works.
And that, frankly, is too where a lot of the traffic is coming from. Number of people actually going to a homepage for any media outlet is shrinking by the day. People are getting there through social referrals, through search, not from visiting someone's homepage.
And I used to hate that. I hated this idea of having my news organization spend so much time crafting a Facebook post. My initial reaction to that was, I despised it. I thought, what are we doing on this? And now I've since been...
Until you can realize that a Facebook post for KOMU can get 15,000 impressions.
Absolutely. Well, I thought Redbox was a dumb idea too, so maybe I'm not the best person to ask about new technology.
No, I mean, Facebook is the place where
Mike's
most young people get their
technologist.
news these days. And so you can curse it in the darkness, or you can become a part of it.
And I think that we all are becoming a part of it. And now I buy in. I think it's a good idea.
Well, again, Mike is our technologist, the one sitting here with the Apple Watch, which is the device I've said I don't buy into just yet. So he's the one we trust.
You'll
on
have
that
it
one.
soon.
Maybe so. That music means we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about all the topics we talked about today. They're on our links blog. Find that under the programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments or questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to KBIA's Trevor Harris for handling the audio. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.